Everybody, and welcome to another Tiger Does Everything video. Today this is all going to be on my hands. Today we are going to be working on some casting and basic knitting stitches. And the first cast on I'm going to show you is just the basic, easiest one. It's my favorite one and I use it for almost everything. So any knitting video you'll see in the future is definitely going to be starting with this one. You can do a slip knot stitch, which you go like this, and then passing the needle in through and tugging it down. I don't use this. For me, this makes the last stitch you work on far too tight, and I often have to just slip it off of the needle and not work with it. So what I do instead is I take a loop of the yarn like this, across the index finger and the thumb, loop around, and just pass the needle onto it. And this is the tail of the non-working yarn. I keep it a little bit long just because I weave it in when I'm done. Alright, so this is going to be the first cast on, and like I said, this is my favorite one. It's easiest, it's fastest, and it leaves a nice loose edge at the bottom, so when you're actually knitting you're not struggling with it to keep it from being all crunched in and tight. This is going to be good for scarves, for sweaters, anything where you don't need a tight hem, which is basically anything that I'm going to work on. Alright, so this is how I hold my yarn. This is the working yarn down here. This is what I'm tugging on. This is the working yarn. I hold it with these two fingers, pass it over my thumb, index, and then my middle finger here holds it just for tension. And with this, with it held in this position, we cross my thumb over this yarn, so it's like this. Put the needle in, let go, and just slide it down. And there we go. We have a first stitch. Take the whole thing, just loop it sideways, put the needle in here, make sure it's all caught onto the needle, and then draw it down. And there we go. Well, another thing I like about this is there's not any waste yarn like you would with a long tail cast on, which will be what I show you next. And the long tail cast on can be used for things that you need a tight hem for. It's not my favorite, in fact I really dislike it, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. For the long tail cast on, as the name suggests, you need a long tail. I go for about 1 inch per stitch. So let's go about a foot. Now, to do the long tail cast on, you're going to need a lot more fingers in play, basically. You're going to hold the tail yarn with your bottom, with your middle ring and pinky finger, and then you're going to pass this. We're now holding the working yarn. This connects to the ball over here. We're going to pass it over the top of your thumb, over the top of your index, and then we're going to hold it down with these 3 fingers. So this is the working yarn, this over here on the thumb side, that's the tail yarn. Now we pass the knitting needle underneath this stretch of yarn that goes from your thumb to your index. So underneath, and then holding it with your index finger of your working hand, you draw it back. So this is how it's going to look now. You pass the needle over top of the thumb, the tail end, and then underneath like this, and then you do the same thing on the index side. You pass it over top and then underneath, and then you bring it out through this loop that's made with the thumb line, and then you draw tight. So let's do that again. We're going to go over top, slide underneath the thumb end, then over top, then underneath the index finger, and then draw it out, and then let go with your thumb, and then draw it tight. The only thing I like about this this cast on is once you get the hang of it, it goes pretty quickly. Other than that, I really dislike this cast on. Yeah, I find it too tight down here, and it gives you an extra line of bulk. But if this is something that works for any pattern that you have, then it's good to at least know it. And for things like cuffs, anything where it needs to be tight, this would be the cast on to use. Other than that, I don't like it. Okay. And then again, you have this long tail. I didn't do the full 10 stitches just because I don't like this cast on. Alright, so using this cast on, and this will work with the first cast on I showed you, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to show you how to do the first row of knitting. We're going to pass the tail end over here. This is just the scrap yarn, and it will get woven in later. So we have the working yarn, which is what connects to the actual ball of yarn. So this is the working yarn, and the first row of knitting is always the most difficult. It is, I think it's probably just because everything is still so tight and we haven't gotten the tension worked out, but it is. The first line of knitting is always the most difficult. So it's the one thing that people, when they do their first row, they're like, I can't do this, is because this first row sucks. So we have our working yarn, which leads to the ball. We have our working needle, which is the same side as this, and we're going to pass it between the first two stitches. We're going to pass it underneath the non-working needle, but keeping the stitch around it. And then a thrower, which is what I am, will take the working yarn, which connects to the ball, and then loop it behind, around, and then in front of the working needle. And then using this index finger, I hold on to the tip of the needle and then pass it in front of the non-working needle with the new stitch on it, and then you just loop it off. Between the stitches, behind the needle, with the stitch holding them both, pass the yarn over, and then work it into the front, and then slide it off. And as I said, this first row of knitting is always the hardest. Everything is too tight or too loose, and it's just very difficult to work with. So don't give up if you have that first line. And I'm going to and there we go, that's finished. Which means if you are planning on stockinette stitch, which is what I use for almost everything because it's faster for one thing, and it will give you a slight ribbed texture, ribbed look to it without actually doing ribbing. For that, you need to learn how to purl, which is basically knitting in the opposite direction. So for this, you take your working yarn, your working needle on the working yarn side, and from the back, you pass it into the stitch, and then pass the yarn over like this. And now, instead of using my index, I use my thumb to make sure the stitch doesn't slip off. And then you pass it off the needle. So from behind, you go underneath, pass this over, use your thumb, and cast it off. And now that there has been a row of knit and a row of purl, you see this side is done in V's, while this side is U's. See, sharper points, U's. And there we go, those are the knits, the basic knits that I will use in almost everything, which means it is now time to show you how to cast off. I'm going to be entirely honest, my first 4 or 5 projects I ever used, I had no idea how to cast off, none whatsoever, so I actually just looped it and tied it and pretended I knew what I was doing. Alright, so this is how you cast off. You create 2 stitches, 2 knit stitches, like this, and then that means you have 2 on the working yarn. Then you take your non-working needle, pass it underneath the first stitch over here, and then draw it over the second. You do another stitch, and then do the same thing. So you'll have 1 stitch on, do a second stitch, and then you pass your needle underneath, and then carefully draw it over the other stitch, and then off the needle. Underneath. And you want a little bit of space between these, so you're pulling this up and away from the needle and then over top of the other stitch. And for the very last stitch, I take it off the needle and then pass the working yarn, because see, you can draw it really loose, pass the working yarn through it, and then you just snip this off, and then you weave the ends in. And obviously any piece that you do is going to be a lot more than two rows, which will bring us to our next video, which I will use these techniques to show you an actual project, which will involve things such as decreases and everything like that. Alright, I hope this helps. Love you all. Bye!